Apart from drastically improving our defence preparedness and therefore underpinning peace and security, this deal is going to modernise our manufacturing and technology base in an unprecedented fashion too. One thing I think we need to accept, though, and embrace is that if we're going to have nuclear-powered submarines and run them ourselves in this country, it makes it absolutely obvious that we will develop a domestic nuclear power industry. I mean, I think nuclear is inevitable anyway, because it's the only way to produce reliable and affordable electricity without carbon emissions. But so long as we have to develop the skills and technology needed to run nuclear subs, of course we need to nurture and expand that through a domestic nuclear power industry. At the moment, there are six countries running nuclear-powered submarines. That's the US, UK, France, Russia, China and India. All those countries have domestic nuclear power industries. Now, I'm not saying these industries are directly linked to their defence programs, but obviously some of the skills and technologies are transferable and complementary. Australia should decide early on to initiate its own domestic nuclear power industry. It could be based in South Australia, like the submarine project, and feed into the national electricity grab. To quote a phrase, you know it makes sense. Yeah, let's go to Michael Shoebridge now from Strategic Analysis Australia. Thanks for joining us, Michael. I've got to get your take on this AUKUS arrangement. We're told it's going to cost $200 billion. We've got the two submarines, US and UK, involved. Can you tell us, firstly, just why nuclear power submarines are essential? Are they an absolutely essential strategic purchase, procurement for this country?
Well, Chris, they make a lot of sense in the region that we live in, because just today we're hearing more from a very aggressive Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, talking about his military being a great wall of steel and continuing that very assertive path that China is on. Nuclear submarines are a very powerful deterrent weapon. And if we don't want conflict in the region, we need to make Beijing's choices much more difficult for it. Nuclear submarines, because they are very hard to detect, have a very long range, and are very capable weapons, are a primary way of deterring a more powerful Beijing.
So if we're going to start off with US Virginia-class submarines, why wouldn't we stick with them? Is it because they're too big, their crews are too big? Or is it because we want to build submarines in Australia and only the UK will allow us to build their subs?
Chris, I think you're closer on the second argument, because the argument that the Virginia is too big and complex for us is pretty hard to make when we're getting them first. If we're getting a smaller, simpler nuclear submarine first and moving to a more complex one, that would be logical. So it's true that the Virginia is the larger, more complex submarine, but really getting the Virginias early gives time for a joint Australia-UK design to be put in place and to really rebuild UK and Australian manufacturing, which is a huge part of what AUKUS is about.
Yeah, and isn't that an important outcome? I know it makes it very expensive and complex, and that $200 billion will assuredly blow out. But if you're talking about sovereign capability, having those skills and that know-how in this country is going to be vital, isn't it?
That's right. Reindustrialising is critical, because you look at the war in Ukraine. If you don't have a production capacity, you can't actually sustain your forces in combat. So just as we're seeing in Ukraine, the ability to make things is much more important than we'd actually accepted for the last 2 decades. And AUKUS is not just about the submarines, it's about the capacity to manufacture other high technology too. That's the right way to think about this.
Now, and just on that, I know the government and certainly defence hierarchy don't want to draw any links to a domestic nuclear industry because they don't want to, I suppose, contaminate the debate, if you like. But it's so obvious, isn't it, for this country, if we're going to develop that manufacturing base and that expertise, and we do have these energy challenges, this will accelerate or certainly make it a lot easier for us to develop a domestic nuclear power industry?
Well, Chris, one of the big challenges is going to be growing all of the skilled workforce. The nuclear engineers are a huge part of that. You can't have nuclear submarines if you can't operate and maintain them safely yourself. You can't just call for help to London or Washington. So that's essential. Really, the kind of investment and way this whole program, this AUKUS program has to be run, has to be entirely different to the sleepy way defence ran that French submarine project. They told no one about it, no one understood it. This has to be the opposite. The crown jewel information about nuclear propulsion has to be kept secure, but the rest of it has to be a whole-of-nation endeavour.
Well said indeed, Michael. Thanks so much for joining us.